Mrs. Gartner, I apologize for having to interrupt just for a moment. I mentioned to Commission Council this morning that an unforeseen personal family matter has required my attention for tomorrow morning, and because I don't know exactly how the day is going to come together, I thought it would be probably more convenient to speak with him about postponing tomorrow's panel until Thursday, or the completion of this panel until Thursday. And I believe he has spoken briefly with the Participants Council. I regret having to do that because I know how hard you all prepare for these hearings and how dedicated and diligent you are with respect to your preparation, but I simply can't avoid this. So I've suggested to Commission Counsel, Mr. McGowan, that after the hearing this afternoon, he would speak with you again to sort out any details around assisting as best we can to meet your convenience. So thank you very much.
I understand it's completely workable for the First Nations representatives to reschedule that way. When we left off at lunch, we were working with First Nations Council's document 53, and we needed to make sure we had the right document. I understand we now have that. Is that correct? And for the record, it's the same document as what we had at 52, except it includes all of the appendices related to the Pensina model. And I'd like to have that marked as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 1203.
And I'd like to take Mr. Jones to page 13 of that document, which is figure 5. And Mr. Jones, this is the model that is being used in the Pensina work, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And for the purposes of our discussions here, of relevance or importance, is that this is a model that includes a number of different First Nations organizations, is that correct?
Yes, it does. It includes First Nations all the way from northern Vancouver Island, to Haida Gwaii and the Prince Rupert area.
And so that's reflected in the far right-hand corner of the governance model there?
Yes, and the First Nations there have agreed to work together with through a governance committee. So there's 4 members of the governance committee from the Haida Gwaii, the Prince Rupert area, the Central Coast, and then also the North Vancouver Islands area. And then those governance committee representatives sit on a steering committee, which is made up of federal and provincial agencies, and then also the 4 governance committee representatives. And I think also some new additions to that, are the province of BC this January, and then also the Namakolas First Nation group from North Vancouver Island.
So that's reflected in the Pacific Interdepartmental Oceans Committee would have both the federal and the provincial governments there now?
That's the Interdepartmental Oceans Committee is a federal provincial committee, which has input to the bilateral coordination. So the government-to-government process involves First Nations, the federal government, and the provincial governments, and that's within a steering committee. And then there's also here it says Secretariat, but the new name is the Planning Office. And so again, that's made up of representatives of the different government agencies, including First Nations.
And this model also includes, as noted in there, a mechanism for stakeholder engagement, working with third parties. Is that correct?
That's right, and that was developed jointly through the planning office and the steering committee. So it includes forums that are held throughout the area twice a year. There's also currently working groups being set up to work on specific issues. Fisheries is one of the issues. And then also there's some of the existing advisory processes. Also there's mechanisms to provide input, I guess, to the marine plan for the Pensima area. That's kind of what we're all working towards, is an integrated marine use plan for the Pensima area. And then the schedule for doing that is currently for June 2012 to have a draft plan which can be recommended to governments for approval.
Thank you. All right, I want to shift the conversation from the possible models that we've talked about. We spoke this morning about the importance of political will, both on the part of First Nations and on the part of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And began to talk about the issue of incentives. Grand Chief Salteri, you spoke briefly this morning about the importance of conservation and sustainability, somewhat, of course, as a priority to the issue of allocation. Could you expand on the types of incentives that First Nations in the Fraser River watershed and the interior, those that you work closely with and represent, what type of incentives they would like to see as it relates to habitat in any kind of co-management regime?
I guess you're asking me that in the event that we're able to sit down and with a good agreement bilaterally, either on a nation-to-nation or a government-to-government basis. So certainly the matter of addressing the issue of habitat would be part of the discussion, improving the habitat in terms of enhancement development for the stocks of fish in our respective territories. Certainly that would be an ability to do that would be an incentive.
And Mr. Todd, from your work with the various First Nations on the Fraser River, would you also see that type of habitat assessment, or I'm going to use the words habitat assessment, rehabilitation, and revitalization, all three of those things, would it be an important route to both ecosystem-based management and the wild salmon policy implementation?
Yes, I agree that it would. So there's a certain amount of that work being undertaken by some First Nation groups with the capacity to do it. There doesn't at this time seem to be linkages, at least directly, to seeing the benefits or the results of that work, but it's work that has to be done, and it will help. It'll be one of the factors leading to the restoration of ecosystem viability.
And a clear collaborative management process or structure or governance structure would make that easier for implementation?
Oh, that'd make it a lot easier for sure. Yeah.
And Mr. Huber, would you agree with that?
Yes, I think another thing with the habitat, though, I had something in mind, I lost it. But is the referral system for First Nations. There, a lot of developments are being referred to them, and they don't have the capacity to respond. So somewhere we have to build that support in there.
And just on that front, from a Department of Fisheries and Oceans perspective, from an incentive perspective, would you agree that a clear collaborative management process that's worked out with First Nations would help you better meet your legal and constitutional obligations?
Definitely, yes.
And would it help you better manage the fishery that's your responsibility to manage?
It would, yes.
Mr. Jones, in your discussions earlier, you've mentioned on a number of occasions the issue of allocation. I want to take you to the recommendation that's found at our place at the table. And it's particularly the recommendation as it relates to allocation. And that's Commission tab 14, Exhibit 493. We can go just to the recommendations. I think they're on the third page, if I've got that right. No, keep going. Fourth, there it is. And you'll see the recommendation as it relates to allocation after, of course, the priority of FSC. As a starting point and as an interim measure, Canada take immediate steps to allocate to First Nations a minimum 50% of share of all fisheries, with the understanding that this may eventually reach 100% in some fisheries. Now, as it relates to Fraser River sockeye salmon, we know, for example, in the early Stewarts that any allocations have already clearly reached, though if there is any allocations to catch early Stewart, that often is 100% to the First Nations. Why did the First Nations panel think that that was a critical component of moving forward towards co-management?
I think it comes back to First Nations interest in the fishery, which is stems from occupation and use of the fish from time immemorial, and I think with as Dr. Harris yesterday talked about kind of the historical the law in some way, in a lot of ways, minimize kind of our access to that fish. And so what this is trying to do is to seek some reconciliation, towards on the First Nations access to fish. I think the 50%, comes from recognizing that we're trying to balance Aboriginal title with Crown title, and here it's put in terms of an interim measure, because there is a treaty process, to negotiate shares, between First Nations, in kind of long-term agreements. But right at this point, where shares are relatively small, the PICFI program is currently providing something like 8 or 9% of retiring about 8 or 9% of all licenses and quotas and transferring that to First Nations. That's really just a start, in terms of what's required to provide incentives to involve First Nation, both so they have economic benefits from the fishery, but also that there's incentive to engage in collaborative management activities.
Mr. Huber, what steps have DFO taken to secure a mandate to negotiate such reallocations with Fraser River First Nations, or the First Nations along the Fraser River migratory route?
It's developmental right now through PICFI. We're building the foundation, the working relationship between the First Nations and the fish that have been harvested through the PICFI program are fish that have been purchased from the commercial fleet, but it's not like treaty-type commitments in the sense of committed in an agreement, a long-term agreement. And then, of course, under AFS, the ATP program has fish have been bought out, and they're also allocated under the AFS program to First Nations.
So when you go to roadmap meetings and talk about moving towards a co-management regime, do you have a mandate to have discussions about reallocation?
We're not talking about that, no.
And so do you agree that that's a problem for moving forward on co-management, given
not
the clear...
at this point.
You don't believe it's a problem?
Not at this point. It will become, but at this point, the developmental stage, I don't think it is.
And Mr. Todd, what do you say to that? Do you agree that that's not a problem that he has an allocation, or is it going to be a necessary part of these discussions?
Me or...
No, I'll start with Neil.
Oh, Neil.
It's definitely going to have to be a necessary part of the discussions. I don't think that it has to be finalized in a huge rush. There's still a lot of, as far as I'm aware anyway, there's still quite a few other things that issues and topics of discussion to clear out of the way. But if the department doesn't acknowledge explicitly to First Nations that allocation and access are out there as a goal to be achieved through developing a joint management process. If that's not clear pretty darn soon, then I don't think that I think the progress made to date is probably going to stall.
Mr. Johns, do you have anything to add, given the work that you did at our place at the table?
I think over the last few years, that there have been conservation issues, with Fraser sockeye, and there have been sometimes the fisheries being limited to food social ceremonial fisheries. So I agree that over the last few years, it makes sense, to focus on the conservation and kind of the management, but there still is some allocation is implicit, in food social ceremonial fisheries, and then as for instance, last year when there was a very large return of Fraser sockeye, that was when there was an opportunity. There was several economic opportunities, fisheries that took place in the Fraser. It was kind of the first time that the PICFI program had been put in place to, retire licenses and transfer allocations to the interior. I know there were some successful fisheries. So I think it does provide kind of, in my view, an incentive, for First Nations to engage in management. And there I'll just draw on, some of the examples I've mentioned before with the Northwest Indian Fish Commission. It was only after Judge Bolt, ruled that the tribes were entitled to up to 50% of salmon that they organized themselves into a management body, the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, and then there was all those benefits that flowed from that. They managed their own fisheries, but they also were involved in conservation and also habitat measures as well. And I think the reason I guess we identified this in our place at the table, and I've worked with the Haida Nation and other First Nations for 20 years, and every meeting you go to, that's what I hear is basically we've lost access to the fishery. We used to have fishing communities where our young people would learn from going out with their father or their grandfather, and the licensing regime that's been put in place, particularly on the coast, has excluded First Nations through that fishery, and it's been through a kind of a market mechanism. This PICFI program is a way of trying to redress some of those policies and how they affected the access of my people to the fishery. Of course, in the Fraser, we heard from Dr. Harris that this happened 100 years ago. When the weirs were made illegal, right, and the sale of fish was made illegal, we were limited to a food social ceremonial fishery. So these steps that the department has taken through the PICFI program are the first step to addressing those long-standing injustices, and they're also they have to continue, or we will be basically just. We won't be able to resolve some of these long-standing issues. We by identifying 50%, we're saying that this is kind of a significant share of the existing fishery. PICFI is a first step, but as I mentioned, that's a sunset program. It ends in March 2012. We had a meeting with First Nations. This is First Nations from the coast and from the interior in June 2nd and 3rd in Richmond, where we talked about the PICFI program and where we're going, and there was support from all 55 representatives attended for renewal of the PICFI program. We're looking for a little over $400 million basically to go into continuing the efforts that have started, efforts towards co-management, but also efforts towards retiring licenses and quota and transferring those to First Nations. And Mr. Commissioner, it would make a great deal of difference if you saw the benefit of that and made some clear recommendations about a continuation, of those kinds of efforts that have started. I know too with the with the roadmap process, one of the things which was not mentioned, I think we've heard that over the last 2 years or so, there's been some progress. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there is a commission that's looking in and doing an inquiry on Fraser sockeye. And that's provided impetus to the Department of Fisheries notions to move ahead. I think it would be very helpful if there was some oversight of that process. I know here, there's opportunity to bring issues, so someone like yourself who's become familiar with the fishery, could certainly help to resolve break log jams. This was something that worked in the United States with the Bolt decision. Like after the Bolt decision, the parties, which would be the tribes, the federal government, and the state government, they weren't used to working together. And numerous issues came up, and Judge Bolt basically oversaw the process, and when disputes came up, they would bring those issues to him, and they reached resolution on those issues, and it helped basically to keep the process moving, and also to achieve the results that were in the long-term interests of all the parties.
So those are two recommendations that you're asking that he consider?
Yes.
I agree with Russ. That allocation issue is important at this time. Unfortunately, when PICFI started and we were moving away from the mixed stock fishery or reducing the harvest rates, we went into this period when there just wasn't fish available. So for many of the First Nations in the interior, it was hard for them to see talking about development of economic fisheries in the interior when they felt their own food fisheries, their traditional fisheries, were being threatened. So what I should qualify as say, I think there should be concurrent development, that we should keep moving with developing the co-management framework, because that framework is what you're going to want to work within as these new opportunities come along, and that'll make a more orderly transition. But I didn't want to see us, while we're waiting for allocation decisions, hold up building the co-management framework or structure that I think is needed.
They're hand in glove.
Yes.
Anybody else on this topic? Grand Chief Salteri?
When you ask about incentives, I think it's important that, there's a lot of things to be addressed, and I believe that dysfunction is not exclusive to the Aboriginal community. And I think that if we're looking for incentives, we've got to find ways and means to be able to get around a lot of the difficulties that we've encountered over the years. And I think that the matter of, for example, of allocation is nothing new to be addressed for our people. For example, in the 1940s and early 50s, there were times when our people were restricted from fishing for our food. And to me, I think some of that, what is the management of the sockeye fishery being done? Why? For whom? Perhaps it is being done. And for a lot of years, I feel that it has been for industry other than Aboriginal people. We've been, there's no incentive to get involved with something where you're not being considered as part of the game. And I think that for many years we've been making efforts to emphasize that we do need to become an integral part of this whole process, and that therefore, to me, incentive would be more along the lines of political matters that need to be addressed, talking about a program, PICFI, a program, when in fact our people need an economic resolution to the situation we find ourselves in. And fishery is one of those resources that perhaps could provide that, certainly. But, we look at as well the matter of our culture. I think Russ here just touched on the fact that our people are losing a lot of their culture because of the fact that there's no resource upon which they could utilize the passing on of practices and traditions within the fishery. And those kind of incentives need to somehow be looked at, and how are they going to be accommodated, and not even speaking about the folks that are really into the spiritual aspects of from the resource as well. So it's if we're looking at incentives, we got to go beyond the matter of enhancement projects like habitat development and restitution or improving the environment, I think it's got to be far reaching than that.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to have to leave this topic of incentives, but before I do that, I'd like to just go to First Nation Commission Coalition's documents 117 and 118, 117 and 118. Mr. Jones, these are communiques. Do you recognize these?
Yes, I do.
I have 117 marked as the next exhibit.
Exhibit 1204.
And 118.
1205.
And in 118 at page 3 is the report out from your Economic Access Community Dialogue sessions. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, and I guess you'll see there that what we are looking for in a kind of a second round of the PICFI program, would be to bring the share of First Nation the First Nation share of commercial fisheries to 33%. So the current PICFI program is something like 8 or 9%, so it is looking at renewal of the program for something like $425 million. And I guess one thing to point out is something like $610 million was spent on the East Coast after the Marshall decision, right, through the Marshall Response Initiative, and also to transfer access, to First Nations on the East Coast. So this would be kind of an initial step at balancing kind of those interests here on the West Coast.
Mr. Huber, I have a couple of questions for you that relate to just clearing up some matters that arise under from the policy and practice report. I wonder if I could go to that now, in a particular paragraph 277. You'll see there, I'm not sure if you've had a chance at all to look at this policy and practice report. It's a long one, so you may not have had the opportunity, but these are documents that the Commission produces, and this is my opportunity to see if we need to correct or shift these. But you'll see in paragraph 277, there's the suggestion the DFO considers participation in the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan process to be the basic form of fisheries co-management. Do you agree with that statement, and do you think that needs to be changed?
I think the wild salmon policy comes closer to the mark, step 4. You look in the provisions in there where it talks about integration, and but it also talks about how to get there. So, yeah, I think it's got to be a lot more comprehensive than what's written there.
And in fact, the work that's underway directly with First Nations is the basic form of fisheries co-management that you're pursuing. Is that correct?
A much broader scope and a lot more structured, yes.
And similarly, if you continue in that paragraph, however, according to DFO, fisheries co-management exists in its most advanced form under Canada's various land claim settlements where co-management is legislated. Do you agree with me that should not be the only form in which advanced co-management is obtained?
Well, I would think that by working with First Nations, we can do something better than that. We can, achieve something more satisfactory. I'm not sure, from what I've seen in treaties, that there aren't room for improvements there, and we're going to be in a situation where we're going to be working with First Nations where there's some negotiating treaties, some never will, and of course some will have treaties. So I think what we're working on is something that will accommodate the various interests and enable us to manage the fisheries together.
Thank you. I want to take you now to First Nations Coalition's document 106. This is again a question for you, Mr. Huber.
I have 3 can numbers under that tab.
Yes,
They're
you'll have to.
particular.
Yeah, we'll have to start just to get the document. We'll try to mark them all together as one.
Okay.
Mr. Huber, I see that you're a recipient of the email that's attached, that's on there. And if you go to the 3rd page into that, you'll see that it includes an attachment of the overview of co-management in DFO Pacific region context and key issues. Is that something that you recognize?
Oh, there's been many emails along that line.
Okay, sorry, so if you go past, out of the email now, the second ring-tailed document in the bundle. As I understand, this is a presentation that was, from the materials, reading the materials, this appears to be a presentation that was made at an internal meeting of DFO in July of 2010 on co-management.
That's right, it was generated by Corey Jackson.
And you were at that meeting, and this is a familiar presentation to you?
To be honest, I don't know if I was at that meeting. There was so many meetings I'm at, and I don't get to all of them.
All right, so if I could take you back to the front page, you'll see that you're a recipient of this presentation.
I would, yes.
All right, could I have that marked as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 1206.
And could I mark both the email and the presentation? The A and B, if you want.
Are they connected?
Yes.
They are? Okay, well, the first one we'll mark as 1006A, and the second one 1006B.
1,206?
No, I'm sorry, 1206A and 1206B.
Thank you. And then if we could go to page 2. If you can, I just have a moment.
Brenda, I need to correct too. That should be 1206 and 1206A. I'm sorry.
And then if I, actually, here's where it happens. If you see the third ring-tail document, there is the agenda for this meeting. And Mr. Huber, you mentioned that you go to a lot of meetings. I can commiserate with you on that. But are you sure you weren't at this meeting? This appears to have been a fairly important meeting given the year.
I'm pretty sure I was at that meeting now that
Thank
I'm
you.
looking at the content there, yes.
Thank you very much. Could I have that agenda marked as, it can be in the same group document.
That'll be marked as 1206B.
And you'll see from the agenda, or I see from the agenda, that in the morning discussions, you have a discussion on the presentation, but then in the afternoon, you go on to do some brainstorming on the development of a co-management framework. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you tell me how far DFO has gone in developing their understanding of the scope and the purpose and the guiding principles and the operational elements and considerations for co-management?
Well, there's been a number of iterations in it, even more recently. It continues to develop. We had a roadmap meeting last week where some new ideas were generated. So, and there's another meeting, even as this meeting is here today, on co-management that Corey Jackson's on. So it's evolving as we make progress in our work with First Nations, both through the roadmap and with the First Nation Fisheries Council co-management working group. And of course, internally, we're advancing our ideas based on the work we're doing.
And how are you getting your mandates for proceeding forward on co-management?
Well, right now, we have our internal communications, but we're also have a focus group, is what I'd call it, where we even have Ottawa staff engaged, so that we want to make sure the communication between for as far as the Fraser and the Marine Approach co-management goes, that we're engaged with area staff, with regional headquarters staff, and with Ottawa. So Corey Jackson and I, on an ongoing basis, update staff more broadly, but we want to have a focus group so that as this develops and issues come up, we've got clear lines of communication all the way to Ottawa.
Great. I want to just, if you could keep that forward. Mr. Huber, in 2003 and 2004, the FRAS and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans commissioned a paper regarding recommendations associated with the watershed agreement. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And I wonder if I could have First Nations Coalition Document 37. Do you recognize that paper?
Yes.
And is that the paper that was commissioned by the department and by FRAS?
Yes.
Could I have that marked as the next exhibit?
1,207.
And if I could go to the last page of that document, there's 13 recommendations that were presented in that paper. You'll recall that?
Yes,
You're familiar with this paper. Do you continue to work with it?
I do.
Thank you.
It's a good paper.
Sorry, right at the end is the recommendations. Can I have it and I'll keep going with the questions? Well,
We have an addition, there's a 3-page addition appendix E to this. Is
That's
that what
right.
you want to go to? Okay.
That's exactly it. At recommendation 4, Mr. Huber, is the recommendations for the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. And it's over on page 2. There are 3 recommendations, one of which is to secure a commitment to resource that process and begin the necessary long-term budget planning for it. How well has the department done on that?
Very well.
How have you secured the commitment to resource the watershed process and the long-term budget that's required for it?
Well, we have resources from AFS, AROM, and the PICFI program. The PICFI program has been, the co-management part of the PICFI program has really helped us in the development and expand this option. But AROM and AFS funding helps people attend the meetings and participate, and helps the process with communications and administrative.
So looking forward in terms of developing and maintaining the capacity that would be required to implement a co-management regime, do you agree that that long-term budget planning is going to be necessary? So if PICFI is sunsetted, that we're going to have some trouble?
It's definitely going to be an issue. I'm looking at costing. I think the first thing we're going to have to do is look at what we can do with the existing AFS and AROM resources. But that'll be an issue, definitely.
And the second recommendation is that you obtain flexible mandates. How well are you doing in obtaining the flexible mandates that are necessary to negotiate the complex components of a co-management regime?
The question that First Nations often ask us at these meetings is how far the department's willing to go. It's my experience over the years, and I'm somewhat resistant to drawing that line. I have seen over the years where we might have been asked that question, and when I look back, we've passed, we've gone further than we might have gone at one time. Because of the, there's politics on the First Nation side and the department side, so I'm more one to develop things, believe in developing things incrementally, get a vision, get ideas on the table, keep making progress, but not be too positional. And it seems to me we've implemented a lot of change once the comfort level is there, and people both in the department and with First Nations are comfortable that the changes that are being made are for the benefit of the parties.
All right, and then the third is the transparent and engaged chain of authority. That's where we were just speaking in terms of being clear who in Ottawa is going to be necessary in order to affect the types of change that co-management would be required, and who in region, and how are you going to access those during these negotiations? How well have you done on that?
Well, I'm well aware of it. I've read that paragraph another number of times. That's Nadia Beaufard's shop in Ottawa. She's the Director General for Aboriginal Policy. That would be our linkage to Ottawa, and she sits with the Deputy Minister. So what we want to do is keep her updated, and there will be points in time where, especially if we get to the point in January where we are in a position to begin negotiation, we've actually advanced it that far, then we're going to have to secure firmer mandates at the senior levels.
We've heard on a number of occasions the value of having a champion, somebody who has the clear ear of Ottawa, and in the case of the First Nations, would have the clear ear of the leadership of the First Nations. Do you see that as a valuable component of trying to negotiate out a co-management arrangement?
Absolutely.
And would others agree?
Yeah, I think that's an essential part. Now, you just give an example with the development of the PICFI program. They identified Pat Chamut, who was Assistant Deputy Minister in Ottawa at the time. He'd been the Regional Director General here. He knew First Nations issues intimately. He was also involved in the Ottawa process, and he was able to bring kind of that the recommendations from our place at the table, along with Pacific Fisheries Reform through, to get this new PICFI program, which was addressing kind of additional resources to provide commercial access to First Nations, as well as the co-management and accountability and such. I think for the Fraser process, I think that is essential. I know that there are certainly some of the past regional director generals here, could do that kind of fulfill that kind of function.
All right, if we had that dedicated leadership and we had incentives and we had the necessary funding, I know those are all ifs, but if we had those, Mr. Huber and Mr. Todd, from your work at Roadmap, how much time do we need to get this done?
I'm retiring next spring, so.
Well, that's significant, but isn't that, Mr. Huber, isn't that significant given the long-standing relationship you have? Is there somebody that's being trained up to step in your shoes?
Well, this came up last week, and what I would like, because of the pending funding crunch that's coming up, not that I'm retiring, that matters. We've got a lot of good people, but I would like to see this advanced by next spring, to the point that we can demonstrate to Ottawa and our staff in the region that we need to continue this process. There's going to be priority setting. There's only so much funding, and the department's going to have to make some hard choices in what they're going to fund. I would like to see that we've made enough progress, and there's enough support from the First Nations leadership and from the department that this continues, and we complete the task of building this management structure, this collaborative management, co-management, shared joint management, whatever we agree to call it. But I'd like to see this completed. To me, it's essential. It's essential for our staff. We cannot manage the workloads when we're scattered and not structured. We need agreements, and people need to know what their responsibilities are, and so everybody, I think, will benefit from completing this work. So whether we can do it with the resources we'll have come April 1st next year or not, I don't know, but I do know that I would argue and make the case that this is an essential work activity that needs to be completed, both in the region. We've made a lot of progress. We've spent a lot of money. The relationships are being built, and it would be, I think, a real loss if we didn't continue.
Mr. Todd, what do you have to say about timing? How long do you think it'll take?
I think it's going to take, and at a guess, about at least 3.5 years to get to a point where both parties know whether an actual working relationship, a joint management agreement, is possible. I don't know that it would be, the terms of that agreement would be negotiated by that time. I don't think so. I think it's going to take a little longer than that, but I think we would get to what I would call an end point of really knowing whether we've hit a dead end and have to try something else, or whether we can proceed. I'm optimistic that we would be proceeding on this course. I think it would be valuable if this Commission of Inquiry sees the value in what's being talked about here today, and throws its weight behind that, I guess. I think that would help in terms of the funding aspects. I guess I'm a little bit pessimistic about the timeline just because of funding. We know that that's a constraint in this present day and in Canada as a whole. I'm also wary of trying to expect too much too fast from the First Nations side of things. It took 10 years for the tribes in the U.S. to get it all together where they became an effective Tier 1 organization. We're just really starting to scratch the surface here within the Fraser watershed in that regard. Through the efforts of Grand Chief Salteri here, there's been some good first steps made, but there's a long way to go. And so therefore, I would just caution people to not be in too much of a rush. But I think 3.5 years is a pretty much a best guesstimate as to, we'll know then as to whether or not we're going to get into it or whether we have to try something else.
And Mr. Jones made a comment earlier about the value of having a third party like Commissioner Cohen or otherwise to have the parties, both First Nations and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, report to as over a consecutive period. Would you agree that that would be useful?
I agree that that would be very useful. There's a lot of things over the years that have not progressed as well as, or eventually as they could have, and eventually maybe even fell apart because there was not a checks and balance. There was not a referee to go to, and to help solve issues and little roadblocks and log jams as they occur, which they will do. Having somebody like that in a position to have the mandate to help solve those things for the parties as they go along will give it the whole process the best chance of success.
Thank you. I'd like to have the Appendix E to that paper that has the 13 recommendations marked as the next exhibit.
Yes, we'll mark that as 1207A.
Mr. Commissioner, my time is well up. I had a few other items that I wanted to clear up, and if there's any opportunity for that before we finish this the panel, that would be great, but I better sit down. Thank you very much for the time, gentlemen.
Mr. Commissioner, the province of British Columbia and Canada have switched spots, so Mr. Tyzik will be next.
Boris Tyzik for the province of British Columbia. Gentlemen, I want to follow on some of the questions that Ms. Gardner and others have asked. I must say you have shortened my list of questions, Ms. Gardner. Don't go that far. But that has been quite helpful. I would like to go to Exhibit 1198, please, Mr. Lunn. And it's more just to get a bit more of an understanding. And Mr. Jones, this is your paper, I believe. And if we go to page 35.
Perhaps that's the wrong document.
What?
Was that 1135?
No, I said, sorry, 1198.
1198.
Is that it? That's the Jones one? No. Oh, I got the wrong number down. Okay, 1199? It's the working models, I'm sorry. Oh, 1202, okay. I can't even say I was close. And yes, and if we go here to page 35, please. And I'd just like to in the under challenges, and this came up a bit in Mr. Todd's answers right here about how long it would take, and we're talking about this lack of a political process. I guess I'd like your views, Mr. Jones, on what sort of a challenge do you see this as, and how long do you think you could get the majority of First Nations to agree to this type of a process? Or do you think that, given the experiences in the past, you could?
Well, maybe I'll give an example. With the First Nation Fishery Council, we developed an action plan. The Leadership Council basically took charge of that, and then they established an interim council that took, and then over 2 years they developed a organizational plan, for the new commission, and then the commission was formed after 2 years. It's now been operating another year and a half or 2 years since then. So I think it does take, kind of organization is not something that, to be a legitimate organization, I think you have to take the time to make sure that that people that are participating are understand exactly what they're doing. You know, you have to develop your goals and your objectives, so you know why you're there, and then you also have to figure out how you're going to address the issues you want, and that all takes time. Once you have an effective organization, I think you can see all the things that you can do, and I think the Northwest Indian Fish Commission is a perfect example, you know, of the many issues that they deal with now. You know, besides salmon, you know, they deal with shellfish and groundfish management. They deal with Endangered Species Act. So I think but I think if you try to rush this initial process, I think you might not end up with a kind of an effective organization. I guess in terms of, you got to think, when you see that challenge too, I mean, this was written back in 4 or 5 years ago, right? And I think there have been developments since then. At that time, I think the Fraser Aboriginal Fisheries Secretariat was still there, but even that process, the technical process, was faltering, right? Because it didn't have the political support. And I think some of those dynamics have changed somewhat. I think I'm encouraged by, you know, what I've heard in terms of some of the recent developments.
Okay, and just to follow on that, with the First Nations Fisheries Commission, we've heard a bit about it, but what sort of a mandate do they have? Does the mandate extend to dealing with allocation issues on behalf of First Nations, or is it more on sort of an upper level relating to government, or is it setting some things out that then the membership can look at? I guess the real question is the First Nations Fisheries Commission in a position to make binding commitments on behalf of its members with respect to everything from allocations to what their rights and title might be to technical issues? A big question. Maybe you could give me little snippets of that.
Yeah, I think you're asking really about what the role is of the First Nation Fishery Council, you know, relative to individual First Nations or other First Nation organizations, and I think it is a balance, right? Because as you know, it's individual First Nations that have Aboriginal rights and title. It's not the First Nations Fisheries Council, but there is the First Nations see the need for some coordination on a provincial level, and we've gone through a process to build support. You know, we have a mandate. You know, we have an action plan, and some issues like we wouldn't go and the Fishery Council, I don't think, would necessarily be involved in an allocation for Fraser River sockeye. I think, and because there are other organizations such as this forum process, and the roadmap process, which are seeking to address those kinds of issues kind of over the long term. We are currently in a process, the Fishery Council is, of developing kind of memorandum of understandings, you know, with different, like the different members of the Leadership Council, you know, and also we're in the medium term, I guess, with some of the ARM bodies, just in terms of what the council does and what the other regional organizations might do. But that's going to take some time as well. I guess the bottom line is that the Fishery Council, you know, does operate through a consensus process, you know, among the representatives, and that so we can't take positions, you know, that are contrary to a First Nation or the organization that's there wouldn't be able to might fall apart, right? And it doesn't mean that, you know, there's not going to be issues that those kinds of issues that they just have to be. You have to have creative ways of dealing with those issues. And I think the same has happened with other organizations. I know with the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, you know, on issues of allocation, some tribal members have gone to court against other members, you know, about the allocations there, and sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. But I mean, having some form of mediation or dispute resolution, you know, is a way of kind of addressing the kinds of issues that you're talking about if you actually get to that point.
Okay, and on that. And on the allocation issue, because it's one that we've been talked about. Has been talked about a fair amount. I believe in recommendation 3 of the report, was it Exhibit 493? which is the
First Nation panel report?
yeah, and there you talk about First Nations dealing with intertribal or inter-First Nation allocations. Is there? How do you foresee that occurring? And then I'd ask that of the other members of the panel as well.
Well, just as an example, earlier this month, as part of this workshop we had, I'm the chair of the Economic Access Work Group. One portion of that workshop, was to discuss intertribal sharing, and so we were looking at principles, right? We were also looking at how it might apply work differently in different fisheries. And when we got support for kind of moving ahead with a kind of a discussion paper to put something more formal, for discussion among First Nations. I know with the in New Zealand, they took 10 years to work out intertribal allocation among the iwi, the different Maori tribes. I know with the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, they had to do that quite quickly, and they came up with a kind of a understanding on how they're going to share the 50% among themselves, because the court told them that if they didn't, then they couldn't manage the fishery. It would be the state or federal government managing the fishery, and then I think that their intertribal sharing has evolved over time since then. So it's not necessarily something that all has to be dealt with at once.
Yeah, and there are I think you said there are 21 tribes.
That's correct.
There. And how many First Nations would be involved in the Fraser River Sockeye allocation process?
I'd probably defer to Mr. Todd.
Mr. Todd?
Or Mr.
Grand Chief Terry on that?
Yes. We're looking at 8 nations that would be involved. Those, by nations, I mean collective communities coming together and forming their nations. And currently, for example, we've been working up to and have now 5 of the nations coming together, and we comprise about 64 communities, and numbering about 36,000 people right now.
And that's with the Intertribal Treaty.
That's right.
Association. Now, on that, in terms of those groups coming together, what sort of mandate or have the individual, if I can call them First Nations, given to the wider nation? Or I guess, what do you envisage and what has happened to date?
We are currently working on having the nation representatives being provided with the authority or the mandate to make decisions that would be binding on each in particular nation. And then they come to a table and share that with the other nation representatives as well. And so we are working on that model of decision making, and we think it is the most practical way to go about it, not only politically, but also financially or economically as well. So.
And you said out of the how many would you said you would envisage 8? Now, would that be for the entire, both the marine, the lower and the upper Fraser?
No, that would be from the mouth of the Fraser on right up to the farthest reaches of the Fraser River and Columbia River systems.
So from the Musqueam right up to the Carrier Second.
That's right.
Council. Thank you. In the there were some questions from the commissioner this morning, and I'd just like to follow up on that with all of you. In terms of this co-management model, and I'll call it that for now, co-management, shared management, joint management, Mr. Huber, that you're working on, and what's coming from the First Nations Fisheries Council and what Grand Chief Terry has talked about, how would all those fit into the existing processes that are there, that Canada has obligations under the Pacific Salmon Treaty, the Fraser River Panel, the IHPC, the Integrated Fisheries Management Plan? How would all of this fit into those in general, and then specifically with respect to the First Nation representation? Grand Chief Terry, would you like to start with that one, please?
Thank you. Yes, the Commissioner had asked a question earlier on as well about how our organizing and talking about these matters here would affect current structures. And we've been in the making the representation that along the river system that our people represent themselves to the Fraser River Panel, and that we would be able to do that utilizing the system that is there. And so we would be choosing our representatives to that particular table. And as was indicated earlier, it is currently, we feel, unfair representation that exists there now, and I think that we need to have a close look at how that the intertribal organization could perhaps fill these positions on a much more fair and just way.
Now, is that for the Fraser River Panel as well as the Pacific Salmon Commission?
Well, the Fraser River Panel is part of the treaty.
Yes.
So, yeah, it's part of the management system of the PSC.
Mr. Jones.
I'll just add, some of these processes that are in place are with the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee. That's a relatively new process. It was something that was put in place, after the Pearson McRae report and our Place at the Table report, and it was meant to be an integrated province-wide process with third parties, and the mandate is fairly limited. It's focused on developing an integrated management plan for the next year. For the salmon fishery. What I see, through the Tier 1 and Tier 2 processes is that the scope is much larger, because you are dealing with more fundamental issues around the fishery, and it will inform those other processes. Maybe those other processes need to change. I'd also point out that with the Fraser River Panel, currently there's a negotiation that started, for the renewal of that annex, and it was the agreement's been carried over for 2 years, and so it's to be renegotiated again after this commission delivers its findings, and so there is an opportunity to look at what kind of changes would be necessary to support better First Nation engagement, or whether it's consultation or a combination of First Nation interests, through that Pacific Salmon Treaty process.
Mr. Todd?
I think I got my personal thoughts off on a slight tangent there, but it was in relation to the Fraser River Panel. I think that if I can try to come back to your question and to take up where Chief Salteri left off there, it's probably too soon to say just how current management processes and functions will change as a result of a joint management agreement for Fraser River sockeye salmon, or for Fraser River salmon as a whole, I should say. So it's a little too soon to predict, but the one thing that's I think that's pretty safe to say is that there will be much better management decision-making processes. And you asked about the Fraser panel. Mr. Jones just explained that the IHPC is sort of something else again, and very, very limited in scope. But the Fraser River panel is an important decision-making, in-season, particularly in-season decision-making body for the prosecution of fisheries. And if the First Nations interests were better represented at that panel, I can guarantee you there would be better decisions made. The panel is very largely influenced by commercial and interests and sort of the commercial aspect of the sport fishing interests. Sometimes that leads to some interesting decisions. 2009, the year that we're kind of concerned with here, I think, Mr. Commissioner, the Fraser River panel made a decision to open fishing by First Nations in the Fraser River on early summer run sockeye. They did so without having any idea of what the in-season run size estimate was. First Nations refused to go fishing because they needed better information than that. It's just an example.
Mr. Huber, may as well.
Well, the work the First Nation Fisheries Council is doing now, it's a relatively new organization, and the work we're doing with the roadmap, the forum process is an annual planning process that involves the Fraser and the Marine Approach Area First Nations, and we've actually implemented that now because it worked and it was supported. It'll be part of the roadmap is much more comprehensive. It deals with things like stewardship, and so in the planning processes, we've got with the First Nations Fisheries Council, we've got the co-management working group. So we have DFO staff and First Nation staff working together on that. On the roadmap process, we have First Nation Fisheries Council representatives on the planning group there. So we are making sure the communication's there. We're meeting together to sort out who's doing what, because we're trying to avoid duplication of effort. So by getting a good team, and we do have a very good team of people working together that have been appointed to these, to the working group and the co-management working group and the Fraser Roadmap Planning Group. And so we will look at how we can work effectively to build this co-management model. The First Nation Fisheries Council is focused on the region as a whole. And if you look at the framework, they will be looking at how these different things that are going on fit together. And the roadmap will be part of the provincial framework eventually if it succeeds in building a co-management structure, collaborative management structure for the Fraser Marine Approach Area. You saw the Penseem already for the North Coast. So you can see pieces are in development, and there's efforts being made by people to sort this out so that we're not duplicating effort, but we're also making sure there's mutual support to get the work that needs to be done. And then eventually, I think we'll come out of all this, like how appointments are made to the Fraser panel. That may change. The Fraser panel will be there. Maybe the numbers of people on the panel will change and how they're appointed. But through this process we're trying to develop, we'll find a much more effective way and much more satisfactory way for First Nations to make those appointments.
One last area that I want to get into, and we've spent a lot of time, you focused on Tier 1, and the First Nations Fishery Council is about that, and the ITO and other things in Tier 2 and the joint management. And we've had a little bit of talk about Tier 3, which I guess, as I understand it, would include all those who have an interest in the fishery, be they the commercial fishers, the recreational fishers, NGOs, and the public in general. Now, in what you're talking about, what role does Tier 3 have here? Or how do you envisage a Tier 3, since this is, you've mentioned it, it's part of the whole process. May I start with you, Grand Chief Terry?
Thank you. Yes, it's certainly a process that needs to be considered as to how it will fit in with On a Nation. In our proposal, we've carried out a number of workshops in which we discuss, for example, governance. We also discuss policy development and policy making. And then we also looked at relationship building. And that falls into that category. And for the intertribal fishery treaty, it called for some kind of a relationship to be developed which would safeguard the salmon to be returning back into our territories because of the need for that sustenance. And if we were able to get that relationship going, then I think we would certainly be able to convey the importance of it. But we're at, one might say, in early stages of development, and it has not been an easy go of it since January of 2009, and there continues to be grave difficulties in pursuing our objective of being able to have our voice heard as structured on a nation-by-nation basis. So it's been a challenge, but one of the things that I, as a leader in there, is I'm insisting that we go at our own pace, because we feel that it is too important a matter to be rushed into, and then find that we have problems in terms of proceeding with the development, whether it be between ourselves as nations, and maybe you're a historian, perhaps, or have an interest, but we've encountered politically, socially, and economically tremendous impacts to our peoples, and many of that has to be overcome and dealt with. At the same time, we're trying to resolve some of these land and resource issues that need to be addressed as well. So it's a difficult road to hoe, but I think it would be good to look at third-party involvement.
Mr. Jones.
Yeah, I think third parties, those users with an interest in the fishery need to be involved in developing management plans and having input. I think that's a given. And it just really is when should they be involved when the issues are First Nation issues. And I'll just give an example from the Integrated Harvest Planning Committee, where food social ceremonial fisheries are outside the scope, of that fishery. So allocations for First Nations for that purpose aren't part of what the plan. What's supposed to happen instead is DFO is supposed to have bilateral meetings with First Nations and try to resolve those issues. But what we've seen is that, to a large extent, those discussions basically haven't been effective. So they haven't resulted in the change that First Nations want. The First Nation Fisheries Council does have a food social ceremonial working group together with DFO. It's a collaborative group, and so that group has developed a work plan. But they still have not made significant progress on many of the issues. And I think the reason is that food social ceremonial purposes do have potential to impact commercial or recreational fisheries, which do have a lot of say and I think in how fisheries are managed. And that's just another reason, why building these effective Tier 1 and Tier 2 process is important. You pointed out, you referred to the paper I did on working models for collaborative management. In there, I looked at existing Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 processes. And you'll see that there's several failed Tier 3 processes kind of from British Columbia. One was the Fraser Watershed process, and the other was the Skeena Watershed process. And the reason those processes failed was because they reached a point where the Department of Fisheries and Oceans wasn't willing, I guess, to negotiate the hard issues, that had to be dealt with in the watershed, or to provide the incentives to deal with the hard issues. But having kind of a strong Tier 2 process or Tier 1, could have resolved those issues to a point, I think, that would have possibly made those other processes successful. So it's just a different approach, you know where you want to get to, but if you don't put the building blocks in place, you're not going to get, you're reducing your chance of getting there.
Thank you. Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Might be an appropriate time for a short break, Mr. Commissioner.
Hearing now recess for 10 minutes.